Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Geneva Blackmer, and I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Interfaith Center to this Jewish-Christian-Muslim dialogue on the theme of recentering our common humanity amidst conflict. The Interfaith Center at Miami University is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that seeks to unify people through relationship building, dialogue, and social action. This program was organized in response to the observation of increased polarization throughout communities in North America, resulting in dangerously high reported rates of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic incidents. While we hope this can be the first of many constructive conversations within the interfaith community surrounding the war in Gaza, we deeply believe the first step in facilitating this dialogue is to draw upon the wisdom of our faith traditions, to recenter our common humanity, and restore our relationships with one another. And in the spirit of cooperation, I'm going to turn it over to our co-moderator, Tahil Sharma, to introduce our co-sponsors.
Thank you so much, Geneva. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Tahil Sharma, and I serve as the regional coordinator for URI North America. And I'm happy to be able to introduce and share gratitude to many of the co-sponsors that decided to help us with putting together this event today. The Greater Kansas City Interfaith Council is a nonprofit 501c3 organization whose mission is to engage the community, celebrate diversity, create harmony, and embrace the sacred. They envision a world that builds the most welcoming community for all people. URI North America, which is where I serve as regional coordinator, is a part of the larger United Religions Initiative Network, which is the largest network of interfaith and grassroots organizations in the world, dedicated to creating daily enduring interfaith cooperation, ending religiously motivated violence, and creating cultures of peace, justice, and healing for the earth and all of its creatures. Through experience and study, CREST promotes the wisdom of primal, Asian, and monotheistic faiths to treat our environment, personal, and social crises. And the Dialogue Institute of Kansas City aims to promote mutual understanding, respect, and cooperation among people of diverse faiths and cultures in the greater Kansas City area, Wichita, and Lawrence by creating opportunities for direct communication and meaningful shared experience. Back to you, Geneva.
Thank you, Tahil. So to be mindful of time, we're going to use shortened biographies for our speakers, but you can view their full background in the Facebook event announcement and also the e-blast that was sent out today from the Interfaith Center if you'd like additional information about all of our speakers. Alan Edelman is the current chair of the Greater Kansas City Interfaith Council and board member of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, the Jewish Community Relations Bureau, and the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem. He previously worked for the Jewish Federation of Greater Kansas City, studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and received his first master's degree in Jewish education from the Jewish Theological Seminary. The Reverend Mark Van Bulk is a minister of the Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA, currently serving as the Associate Pastor for Family and Campus Ministries at Oxford Presbyterian Church in Oxford, Ohio, since 2018. He received his Master's of Divinity degree from Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, and served on the board of directors at the Interfaith Center from 2020 to 2023. Dr. Ashraf Trabulsi completed his PhD and postdoc from the University of Kentucky and has served as a member of the board of directors and the executive committee of the Islamic Center of Greater Cincinnati since 2012 and was the vice chair of the board from 2013 to 2019. He's a founding board member of the Syrian American Foundation, the Institute of Youth Development, and the Union of Medical Care and Relief Organizations.
So just before we begin this conversation, we are inviting, our participants on the call today into thinking about these community guidelines that we've created to be able to think about how we engage topics like the ones we're focusing on today, and how we think about engaging in a constructive way in topics that might matter to our communities on the ground. So the ground rules are very simple. First is that this dialogue is for the purpose of understanding different perspectives while also exploring the nuances of various worldviews. Therefore, we invite people to speak from a place of personal wisdom and understanding, using I statements and shared learning, not trying to create a space of hostility through debate, to convincing one another or to proselytize to one another about our convictions. Second, this is a space for constructive engagement. So, as we invite authentic sharing, we will also be inviting active listening as best practices for how we engage in this conversation. And if there are any moments where things may not make sense, or if any participant feels that there is a spark of curiosity, we invite you to ask clarifying questions. We are going to be asking the panelists to speak, for 4 to 5 minutes for every question we ask. And we understand maybe things may not go in the directions we're thinking, but we invite the opportunity also to be mindful, to be adaptive, and to be able to engage as deeply as possible. So I'll begin with the first question. How do we remain in relationship with one another as children of God, according to the monotheistic faiths represented today, when it feels like our lives are under attack? And I will start off with how we went in the order of the bios. So, Alan, if you'd like to go ahead. Oh, if you could unmute.
Sorry. You'd think after all this time. War is a horrible thing, and war has been going on for almost as long as humankind has been on this earth, or at least recorded history. It is sad and unfortunate that over the centuries, so many people have died and been killed in the name of God, in the perspective of their faith tradition. And it just seems so counterintuitive when we've been taught that we are all created in the image of God, and that we all have the spark of God within us. How could anyone possibly murder another people in the name of that same God? So as difficult as the times of war and conflict are, we need to keep that in mind, and we need to remember the godliness in all of us, which will hopefully make enough of us pursue peace and do what we can to change the course of violent wars, violence, prejudice, which of course comes from ignorance, which can only be addressed when we know each other. So dialogue like this is essential in moving past the pain of violence and death and war.
Thank you for that, Alan. Reverend Mark?
I just want to echo what Alan said. I think that was beautifully, beautifully said. And I especially appreciate, Alan, what you said theologically, that we are all of us created in the image of God. That's one of our, I believe, one of our sort of shared faith codas. And it's painful to live through times of war, of international tragedy, like you said. Because we see how different persons are victimized in that way. And so we do want to try to work towards, how can we create more peaceful neighborhoods and more inclusive neighborhoods, where we are now. I have a friend and colleague, Reverend Rob Jackson, who serves in the Presbyterian Church as I do. And he will sometimes say if an issue is national or international, it is also local. Which means that there's always work that we can do in the local community to try to engender peace, to try to engender understanding, to try to engender listening and dialogue, which is what the work of the Interfaith Center does. And I think that's wonderful. So there's no easy answer to conflicts like this. But I think a good first step that any of us can do is to at the very least recognize the humanity in one another. For those of us who view this through a non-secular lens, to try to see the image of God in the person in front of us. And I think at the very least, that's a good starting point for dialogue.
Thank you so much. Ashraf?
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, wherever you are. Just want to start by thanking the organizers, the sponsors, and my esteemed panelists. And I would start with the customary start in Islamic faith. We say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. And we do that to center ourselves on what is the objective of our life? And what's the objective of everything we do is to specifically seek the pleasure of God and be following on his command and his guidelines that he put for us from in our faith, basically. And I just want to touch on a quick point as we talk about the concept of children of God, and we created in the image of God. Maybe from an Islamic perspective, there is a little bit of difference there, that we consider ourselves. This might be metaphorically the idea. We in Islam, we believe that we are the creations of God. We are dependent on God, but we are nothing like God. So just want to make sure that, at least from my Islamic perspective, just outline that piece because it's important. However, based on that also start that I told you about, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, we approach this from the same context. What is the guidelines? What is the guardrails that God put for us in our faith to do this, to do interaction with other people, even in times of crisis like what we are talking about right now? And there are certain principles that we follow, and these are, entrenched in our education, in our religious textbooks, and our religious resources. So starting with the first principle is a verse in the Quran that says, in the meaning more or less, "O you mankind, we have created you from a male and female, and we made you into nations and tribes so you might get to know each other. And indeed, the most honored and the most honored of you in the eyesight of God are those who are most benevolent and most pious." So that context is very important. That's what God is compelling and ordering us, commanding us to get to know each other, despite of our differences, despite of our maybe different belief systems or how we conduct ourselves. The other context, the other guidelines that we follow, which is also in our Quran, in the holy book of Islam, which says, "Ta'awanu 'alal birri wat taqwa wa la ta'awanu 'alal ithmi wal 'udwan." Help each other in benevolence and good, and do not help each other on vice and aggression. So these are guiding principles for us as Muslims as we pursue interaction with different groups. And as both Alan and Mark indicated, it started with dialogue. It started with opening channel of communication and having the dialogue within those frameworks that I have shared to reach a common goal or common objective that we can achieve to benefit others, to alleviate suffering, to change condition to the best, or at least take it one step above where it is today.
Thank you to all three of you for your thoughtful responses. Moving into the next prompt, how can we recognize the humanity in others when we feel their positions threaten our right to exist? And I guess just start with Alan, just keep going in that order, if everyone's comfortable with that.
Sure. Again, I think people of goodwill, people who are not motivated by politics, by hate, by a desire to control other people, have to stand up and represent what is right and what is good. And that's difficult to do very often in the midst of what's going on in the world. And we've seen on college campuses so many terrible examples of anti-Semitism, of Islamophobia, because people who are promulgating hate instead of understanding are getting all the attention or winning. And you look at the universities who've said, we're not going to have any demonstrations. We don't want this group coming out against that group. We're going to have teach-ins. We're going to have learning experiences. A university is a place to come and learn. A university is a place to meet people different than the people you grew up with, who your parents said, this is who you were going to associate with, etc. You go to that great university and there are knowledgeable people, scholars, historians, politicians, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a perfect setting for coming together. And those universities that have said no demonstrations, no words of hate, but come to this session and learn from each other, learn the two narratives that are not getting the attention, because most of our students, unfortunately, don't know the history, don't have the background, and they very often just get caught up emotionally in this side or the other side. And I believe that when we can come together in a way to understand one another, to respect one another, to see the humanity, in one another, then the conflict, it may still be there, but we can begin to shift the focus from hatred and fear to understanding and hopefully resolution. Unfortunately, so many of us are powerless because we don't have the control. We're not the politicians. We don't have the weapons. We don't have the the political force, but we can stand up to it. I'm a baby boomer, and I demonstrated against the war in Vietnam because it wasn't a just war, according to a lot of people. Obviously, there were people who thought it was a just war, but that didn't stop many of us from going to the streets. And that's what we need to do. We need to stand up and protest the behavior of our leaders who are not acting in ways to resolve conflict, but rather fuel the conflict.
Thank you, Alan. Mark, over to you.
Thank you. Yes. This is a conversation where first I want to just own that I'm coming at this particular prompt as a Presbyterian, Protestant, straight, cisgender, white male living in America. And so when it comes to a conversation around points of view that threaten my right to exist, I'm sitting in a very privileged position in a conversation in that topic. And so I just want to acknowledge that I've lived most of my life in a position of enormous privilege when it comes to danger or anything like that. But I also am approaching this as a Christian. And in the Christian faith, Jesus was somebody who, as Alan kind of alluded to earlier, was a witness who would stand up for what was right or what was faithful, even when it was difficult, even when it was dangerous per se, even when there could be backlash and things like that. And I think it's very difficult, honestly, for public faith leaders to have the courage to do that because there are all sorts of forces in the world that could maybe threaten your job or threaten your safety in some contexts or circumstances. But I do think there is an importance, especially for people like me who are in positions of privilege, to try to speak the truth and to be a faithful witness in the community, even if there is a risk of resistance. Resistance is not always a bad thing. I think when there's conflict is not always a bad thing. There can be really fruitful and productive dialogue, even when there's conflict, if it's done in a faithful, healthy, and good faith way, if you'll pardon the expression. But I think the first thought that I have is I look to the person of Jesus, who was willing to try to be a faithful example even when it's hard, and sometimes I'm not always good at doing that.
Thank you, Mark.
Guess it's my turn.
Yes.
Right.
Sorry, I'm muted, so I didn't think I needed to ask you. Sorry.
So I think I'm going to start in the same place where Alan started. Honestly, it's the whole idea of set politics aside, set hate aside. The minute there is an element of hate, things start to go in the wrong direction. And stand up for justice. That's really the bottom line. Mark also mentioned that in a different context, but that's really really the root of it. And I'm speaking of this from an Islamic perspective, as I'm representative of my faith at this point in this panel. And I go back to the principles and guidelines. Again, in the Quran, God tells us in a very specific fashion. He says, in the meaning, again, do not let your enmity or your conflict with a group of people prevent you from exercising justice. Exercise justice, it's closer to piety. If we want to follow the command of God, we need to stand up for justice, no matter whose that is, against our own self, against our own brothers and sisters and family and community, if that's the case. And in the tradition of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he also told us, give help and support to your brother if he is an aggressor or if he is being aggressed upon. So his companion were confused and said, what do you mean? How can we if he's being transgressed upon, it's easy to give him help. But how about if he is the transgressor? He said, by stopping him from his aggression. Take stand to stop that aggression, because that's help for your brother and your sister. So really, that's one of the guiding principles for us as Muslims to deal with these situations when people are. It doesn't matter how difficult we face, how difficult we feel. We need to exercise justice. That's one. The other thing, there is another element in our faith that tells us that life is not a walk in the park, and you'll be tested. You'll go through trials and tribulation, and you will be subjected to harassment, you will be subjected to aggression, but you need to conduct yourself with the utmost piety, with the utmost justice to other who are not abusing you. And in that context also, there is a verse in the Quran that says God does not command you to interact and deal with people who are not fighting you, who are not driving you away from your homes and your countries. You should deal with them with benevolence. You should be dealing with them with justice. Indeed, God loves those who exercise justice. So in that context, it's very important to stand up for justice. The last point I would like to mention also it's rooted in our faith, is to appreciate that no matter how difficult the situation you are going through, others has gone through difficult situation. So acknowledge their own suffering and acknowledge their own experiences as you are contemplating your own experience. Again, God says in the Quran, I would always refer to the Quran because that's where I look for guidance. God says, if you are going and being touched by some difficult calamity and tribulation, then remember, the other party or other people have gone through similar trials and tribulation. And this is the facts of this life, that it turns around. There's a good day, there's a day for you and day against you. And you need to stand, you need to endure, you need to persist, and you need to deal with this in the right fashion. So going back to the start, stand up for justice, no matter what it is, and no matter who is it that you need to stand up for.
Thank you all for those responses, and I think it very seamlessly enters into the next prompt that is, I think, very important for folks to hear when we think about this idea of recognizing the humanity of others, even in the face of so much going on, which is, what are the resources within our faith traditions which guide us in this understanding?
It's been, one of the interesting questions is, if the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the rest of the Hebrew Bible, if the Torah was given to the Jewish people, then why didn't the Torah start with Abraham? Abraham was the first monotheist. Abraham was the first Jew, Hebrew, as he was called at the time. So why does the Torah start with the creation story and these ideas that were created in the image of God? And at the same time, there are ideological stories in the first 11 chapters of the 5 books of Moses before we get to Abraham in chapter 12. And we learn about conflict. We learn about Cain killing Abel. We learn about not following God's teachings in the Garden of Eden story. We learn about the Tower of Babel, where people couldn't get along. And then when Abraham comes along, God gives him this unique blessing that in exchange for following God's teachings, God will bless him to be a great nation and promising him a piece of real estate, and that we call the Promised Land, the Holy Land. And Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And so a land for two peoples goes back 4,000 years. And in that same Torah later on, when God gives the law at Sinai, 36 times in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, it says that we are supposed to treat the stranger in our midst because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. 36 times. That when we engage in battle after being enslaved in Egypt, wandering 40 years, we come to the Promised Land, and Moses outlines God's teachings for engagement. And first you have to make peace with the people who are living there. If they don't want to make peace and you have to go to war, there's no raping and pillaging and taking of spoils. There's no destroying of fruit trees because there's very little to eat in the Middle East. So, and it also says, as Ashraf reminded us, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue. And the rabbis ask, well, why did you repeat the word justice? And our rabbis teach us that it's repeated because do justice when it's easy and do justice when it's difficult, as Ashraf reminded us, because it's not always easy. And the prophets who taught us lo yisagoy al goy cherev, lo yilmadu od milchama. You shall not teach war. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And the prophets emphasize this. And we've had centuries, as I said, of killing in the name of God, liberating the Holy Land for the infidels, hatred of each other, massacres. I'm going to Morocco at the end of March, and I'm doing some reading to prepare. And the history of Morocco, here our 3 faiths are represented. And it's not a pretty history because there was so much conflict. Every page is throughout the history after the Roman period of Jews and Christians and Muslims not getting along. And sometimes they did get along, as Ashraf reminded us. There were good times, but there were challenging times as well. And today, we have a situation where we have 2 traumatized people. The Jewish people who suffered at the hands of the Nazis during the Second World War and the Holocaust, and the Palestinians who have experienced the Nakba when Israel's independence was declared in 1948. So here we are again, this 4,000-year conflict, and so this is what our tradition teaches us about justice, about not pursuing war, about treating the stranger in our midst, and that to me calls for outreach and reconciliation and rebuilding. And I'm proud that there's so many organizations in Israel with which I've become associated with and affiliated with that are working hard, Israelis and Palestinians pursuing peace and following the teachings of our respective traditions.
I suppose it's my turn. Yes, Alan, well said. And like Alan, I also found myself looking to the law of Moses when thinking about resources in our faith. I found myself looking to the words of Leviticus 19: when a foreigner resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the foreigner. The one who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen among you. And in the Christian New Testament, Jesus is constantly crossing barriers into the company of people whom the society around him thought he shouldn't be interacting with. There were people who were considered outsiders, outcasts, or just people we don't associate with. And Jesus was always crossing over those boundaries in order to build those relationships, in order to broaden the community of God even wider. Jesus also teaches his disciples in Matthew 5 you've heard it said to love your neighbor as you love yourself. I'm going to take it a step further and to say to love your enemy. And to me, that's one of the most difficult teachings Jesus puts forth. I mean, we see that even when Jesus is on the cross being executed, he is crying out to God for the forgiveness of the people who are doing him harm. And, I think that's an incredibly difficult theological concept to ponder, especially when we do experience relationships that where sometimes it's not healthy to remain in relationship with someone if it's become abusive, or it's simply no longer healthy or fruitful. Sometimes we determine that the most loving thing we can do is to go our separate ways. But when I find myself getting too comfortable in my own sense of self-righteousness, or my own sense of judgment of somebody else, or if I feel myself even thinking of someone else with hate, I try to remember the teaching of Jesus to love my enemy, which is to say, don't fall into the seduction of dehumanizing people around us. I think that's what often leads to violence and a lot of the problems that we're in. So those are just a couple of resources. And Alan, I feel like I'm sort of piggybacking off of you. And Ashraf, I really appreciate the words you lifted up as well. So, yeah.
All right. I guess by my first two responses, it's very clear that in general, when we look for guidance in the Holy Book, in the Quran, and not only in the Quran, we look for guidance in the Quran and in the tradition, in our tradition. Our tradition is interestingly inclusive. The life of Prophet Muhammad and his saying and his action throughout his life is inclusive of other faith tradition. I mean, Islam acknowledge both Judaism as Christianity as monotheistic divine religion. Islam acknowledge Moses and Jesus as prophets of God, as brothers actually of faith. The concept of all prophets being brothers delivering the same message of worshiping only one God is rooted in our Islamic principles. So we really look for, always we go back to the Quran for guidance. We go back to the tradition of our Prophet Muhammad, the tradition of our faith, and inclusive of all other, elements that came before Islam that's included in our tradition because it's from the same source, from God. We also look for guidance for our Islamic history and the conduct and how people conducted themselves in the right times. As Alan indicated, there are periods of history where people acted in the name of religion to promote hate, to promote violence, but there are also times when people really implemented things in the way they were supposed to do, to implement them. So we'll look for those context and understand how we can conduct ourselves. In my own viewpoint, for example, I look at the example of Saladin and how did he deal with the Crusaders after they pillaged the city of Jerusalem and after they controlled it for almost 90 years, and he had the upper hand over the Crusaders. How he dealt with the Crusader, how he let them go, and he did not, kill those who killed, and destroyed those who destroyed. That is an important lesson for us. Alan also mentioned the example of Morocco, which brought to me some additional kind of context. Also, is that during the Inquisition, it's very instructive to understand the dialogue between the three religions. Is that during the time of the Inquisition, the Jews of Andalusia start to flee with the Muslims into Morocco and Tunisia, and that's what led to having a sizable Jewish minority in those areas, where some of the oldest synagogue actually in the island of Jarba in Tunisia, because of that group of Jews who ran away from the Inquisition with the Muslims. We have periods in our history as faith tradition where we were very collaborative. We worked together. We respected each other, and I think we need to build on those periods of history rather than on the other side of history. The last point I'd like to make, and specifically to the current conflict, and it's very much ingrained in people's mind that this is a religious conflict, which is it presented that way sometimes. It's almost like a conflict between Jews and Muslims, and the reality, it's not. This is a conflict. This is a political conflict. This is a conflict about right, about water, about land, about resources. It is not about religion. However, it happens that the people are Muslim and the people are Jews, and each people resort to their faith to guide their conduct and their practices. So though it's between two different people of two different faith, but really the root of the conflict is a conflict about rights. It's a conflict about resources. It's a conflict about land. Whose land is this land? And that's really important to understand, because some people might think this conflict is 600, 200, 1200 years old since Muslims came to Palestine. That is not the case. It's Muslims and Jews lives in Palestine for a long time and together, and in a way where despite the fact that Muslims ruled the Middle East for 1400 years, as I said, the oldest Christian monastery, the oldest synagogues in the world are in the Middle East, despite the fact that they lived under Islamic rule for 1400 years. So that tolerance and that acceptance of others that we lived through periods of our history is something that we need to learn from, and we need to re-implement nowadays and understand how we can build upon it.
Thank you, Dr. Trabulsi, and thank you to all of the panelists. I think that's a very good segue into our fourth and final question of how do we respond to those reaching out to us from the other side in good faith? And I will turn it to Alan for the first response.
Well, I really love so much of what Reverend Mark said and what Ashraf said. And, when I spoke of being created in the image of God, that these conflicts, as Ashraf said, is not a religious conflict. And it's sad that people of faith, quote unquote, use their interpretations of their holy books, either the Quran or the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, to justify very unholy and very anti-theological, spiritual ideas. And I couldn't agree more with Ashraf that that's politics. As soon as it crosses over into not being godlike, it is politics. There's so many, after taking 36 trips to Israel on behalf of the Jewish community, from students to teachers to community leaders, my dream was always to take an interfaith peace pilgrimage of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And just before COVID, my dream came true with a Presbyterian minister friend and a Muslim friend, and we had 30 amazing people, Muslims, Christians, and Jews. We had a Palestinian guide and an Israeli guide, and it was one of the most unique experiences. And we visited the sites holy to the three Abrahamic faiths during the day, and in the afternoon and evening, we met with Palestinian and Israelis working toward peace. And it was so inspirational. And my own personal experience, 1972, when I studied at the Hebrew University at age 21, I, being the typical Jewish suburban kid, grew up learning one narrative. The Arabs want to push us into the sea. The Arabs want to kill us. And for the first time in my life, I met Palestinians, and I heard their narrative for the first time in my life. And from that point on, I became committed to educating people, Jewish people in particular, in my sphere of influence, about the history of the conflict and the opportunity to meet Palestinian people. And in setting up our sister city in Kansas City, we have a sister city with Ramle, R-A-M-L-E, which is an Israeli city established by Muslims in the 8th century, 22%. It was predominantly an Arab country, a city before, and our mayor, who was African American before 1948, and our mayor, who was African American at the time, said, "I want a mixed city. I don't want just a city, a Jewish city. I want a city mixed." And it has over 23% Arab population. And through that partnership, I've come to learn even more about that. So the dialogue, you know, we have to reach out. We have to meet people. We have to go together to the Holy Land and learn and understand that there needs to be 2 states for 2 people. It's the only solution. And as difficult as it might be, many people believe, just as in Northern Ireland, just as in other points of conflict in the world where there was so much killing on both sides, maybe this is the time for us to say enough killing, and we need to start working toward peace. And thank goodness there are many Palestinians and Israelis who are working toward peace, who want to see peace, and they see the humanity in one another. So as difficult as it is at this time, and I got an email from my favorite guide in Israel who just put together a program with Palestinian guides and Israeli guides, and she didn't think anybody would show up, and 17 people came. So I think those are rays of hope and light, and we need to do, as Ashraf said, we need to do the just thing and the right thing, and people of faith can make that happen.
Yeah, I've just appreciated the dialogue that's already been taking place in this conversation. You know, Ashraf, I really appreciated towards the beginning of this discussion, you pointed out gently and tactfully a nuance in our 3 faiths, which is, you know, Alan and I both come from faith traditions where that hold the theology that we are all created in the image of God. Ashraf, as you very well educated us in the Muslim tradition, the teaching is that we are all children of God, creations of God, but we are not like God. Am I saying that right? I want to make sure that I'm articulating that right. And what I sort of take away from conversations like this is, at the end of the day, we are all of us leaning into a mystery that is ultimately bigger than us. We're leaning into a mystery that we cannot understand. And I think that part of that can help guide us in the prompt asks, you know, how do we respond to those reaching out to us in good faith? I think part of it is to recognize that we are all trying to we're all trying, hopefully, if we are in good faith, we're trying to live into this mystery together. Jesus was asked this question constantly. I mean, Jesus was approached by people who were considered by people in his neighborhood to be, you know, outside of those categories. Oh, how can you interact with tax collectors? How can you interact with, you know, hookers and crooks? How can you interact with so and so? And you know, at the end of the day, in Jesus's eyes, they're children of God, as we all are. And so, you know, my ministry context is in a college town. I live here in Oxford, Ohio, and we have heard stories in the sort of campus ministry circles that we run in of students at Miami University, students who are Muslim, students who are Jewish, who don't always feel safe, who have been victims of hate, violence, and crime. And Alan, I really resonated with what you said earlier, that college students shouldn't have to worry about that, regardless of what their faith background is or what our political backgrounds are. College should be a time when you're learning who you are and you're being formed as a person and formed as a human being. And my question as a faith leader here in Oxford is, how can I help contribute to a neighborhood that is safe for Muslim students, for Jewish students, for Christian students, students who are not of faith? How can I help just make the neighborhood safer for students and young people? Because, as we said earlier, if issues are international, they're also local. So that's my 2 cents on that.
This, I mean, I think I can build on both points discussed with both esteemed panelists before me. The key here is acknowledging the humanity of everyone. And as people reach out, is to always think about it in context, and what is the guidelines, and what is the objective of that reach out? What is the outcome intended from that reach out? We need to work for a purpose, and if that purpose is upholding justice and upholding righteousness, then we should engage as much as possible. There is another element in Islamic tradition, that there is a context of anything that could fend harm and bring goodness or benefit is something that one should engage in. And fending harm is actually even more important than bringing good, because if you can prevent killing, you can prevent something atrocious. And when people are reaching out to collaborate on how can we stop killing, then this is something that nobody should, refuse. But that's generally a principle. And again, I go back to all the quotes and all the principles that I shared. Is we drive from those quotes, from these verses in the Quran, from the teaching of our faith, we drive a course of action, and that course of action is applicable to ourselves and to others. We should hold ourselves to the same standard that we hold others. When we expect others to acknowledge us, we need to acknowledge them. When we expect others to give us certain rights, we need to understand that we need to give them certain rights. And I think there was a question in the chat, is like, how is justice exercised? I mean, again, this is a very deep question. This is not an easy question, and I don't think any one of us here can cover that completely. But there are principles, at least in my faith, there is a very principle, and Mark referred to this in his words a few minutes ago. But there's a concept that says none will achieve perfect faith until they would love for other people what they love for themselves. This is in principle what justice is. This is exactly what justice is what I want for myself, others should have the right to. If I want safety, if I want independence, if I want freedom, if I want education, if I want prosperity for myself, then I should also want that to others. Or at least at minimum, my safety and my prosperity and my rights should not impinge or interfere with others or harm others in that context. So these are important principles that I think we go back to. And sometimes as faith tradition, I think one of our most important function that we need to do is to educate. And maybe there is an education element with regard to the Muslim faith that's a little bit higher standard than others, because Islam is relatively new to America. I mean, when I mean relatively new, Islam has been here since the coming of the slaves, because 40% of African slaves who came to the United States were Muslims. They were forcefully brought here, and they were forcefully forced to abandon their faith. So Islam is not old. However, Muslims' presence and Muslims kind of being a participant is relatively no more than 50 years old at this point in this country, and it's gaining more. So we have a responsibility to educate others about who we are, what we believe in, and because people get antsy about what they don't know, and they might have the wrong understanding and the wrong context and the wrong ideas. But then if you dig deep into it and if you understand it, it's very relevant, and it's very I don't think I want to say it's the same, but it's not that different. Let's put it that way.
Thank you to all three of you for your responses. And I think maybe since Ashraf already brought up one of the questions in the chat, and we're moving now into the Q&A, if if either Mark or Alan would like to respond to that same question, What is the working definition of justice, and how is justice exercised? Was there anything anyone wanted to add to that?
Mark, I defer to you.
It's
I'm
a
happy.
well, as Ashraf said, it's a very big question. It's an important question, and it's a big question. I don't know. Ashraf, I'm gonna echo you a little bit here. I don't know that we can answer it exhaustively and definitively this afternoon. My personal 2 cents on this is I think it's it's circumstantial. For different peoples in different situations, justice is going to look, it will not always look the same for each person, for each group of people, for each moment in history. My vision of justice may look different from yours and vice versa. But I think one starting point that might be helpful is that when we're in dialogue like this, is to do a lot of listening, to really listen to, what's at stake for you? What's at stake for the persons involved? And what does justice look like? And I think that those kind of questions can lead to a conversation of what steps can we take to try to exercise it, as the questioner in the FAQ raised. That's a vague answer, but I think those are some tangible steps that we can take, is to just sort of is to do a lot of listening. Because it is going to be subjective for different peoples in different moments in time. Alan, I don't know if you want to if you want to piggyback off that, or you may have some different thoughts. I don't know.
Yeah, to me, I mean, we're talking here. What brought us together is the Gaza-Israel war. I mean, to me, justice is the opportunity for each of the peoples to live in peace under their vine and fig tree, and not be mistreated, not to have the opportunity to live a good life. And as Ashraf said, Jews and Muslims live together, and Christians, because there's Christian Palestinians as well, live together in peace. There have been examples in our past, and we can return to it. And the Oslo Accords, of all the opportunities for peace, the Oslo Accords came the closest. And there was going to be opportunity where everybody was controlling their own well-being. That, to me, that's justice in this particular case. And justice can only be achieved when the Palestinians have a home of their own, that they control their lives, and those living in Israel, call them Jewish people, if you will. But again, I think when there's true peace and there's justice, Jews, Muslims, and Christians can live in Palestine. Jews, Muslims, and Christians can live in Israel, as they do. And to me, that's justice in terms of what we're talking about here. And for people to understand and to go into a dialogue saying, again, all these rallies that are taking place, it's, we have a right to the land, they don't. We have a right to the land, they don't. That's not justice. If people really spend the time learning about the history and being committed to justice for both sides, for both Palestinians and Israelis, then I think we can come to that. But not as long as people are saying it's my land, not your land.
And if I may add just one couple of points with regard to Mark's point about listening and in these dialogues and in other dialogues, I would maybe add a little bit and say we should be engaged in active listening, and in that active listening, my point, the point I'm not trying here to say is, we come to those arguments or to those discussions in general with our own perceived and ideas. We have starting points, and when we are going to listen in an open listening approach, I would use the example of one of the eminent scholars in Islam says, my opinion is right, but it could be wrong. And your opinion is wrong, but it could be right. So if we are approaching things from that context, we might learn from each other. But if we come with our preconditions and we're not willing to change, then dialogue is not going to achieve anything, because We need to listen to the other person, and we need to get to understand their point of view. And with what Alan has just talked about what do we need to do to achieve justice. I mean, maybe I'll take it a little bit further than what Alan has indicated, but I would say at minimum, United Nations resolutions need to be implemented. And those United Nations resolutions need to be protecting the rights of people. I mean, in general, right now, nobody's speaking about the refugees or the Palestinian who were the huge refugee crisis that was created by the Nakba. And what's the rights of those people who have been driven from their homes and from their villages, and how are we going to address their plight, and how are we going to deliver justice to them? This is almost missing in that context. So, and justice for some is basically injustice for all. So you have to be inclusive in the implementation of justice. One of the questions on the chat is what can we do? What we should be reacting? From my perspective, I think every sane human being, we should at least say stop the insanity, and we should be pushing for a ceasefire, because if there's no ceasefire, the killing is continuing, and the killing it should stop. I mean, that's from my perspective, is like what we should do. Honestly, the ceasefire should be a request for every sane human being, because what's happening now is insanity. And in the definition of insanity is basically doing the same thing and expecting different results. There have been so many other instances where conflict has raged before in this area, and killing never resulted in solutions. Killing and never resulted in peace. So we're just repeating another cycle of that at this point, but at a very high cost at this point, and it's a very high impact that's impacting 2.4 million people at this point.
And I would add that in addition to a ceasefire, the release of hostages.
And I would say the release of hostages on both sides.
Yep.
Because there are 6,000 Palestinians being detained right now in Israel. So I don't want to, I want to stay from what we started with and not make it tit for tat. But I would say when we speak about hostages, we really need to think about hostages of the other side, because they are also human beings, and they also have family, and they have children, and they have aspirations.
I agree completely with both of you. And this is such an important question, because I think especially today, it's for so many people, it's easy for us here in the United States to feel paralyzed by a situation like this. It's so big, and in many ways it's outside of the control of much of us of ordinary citizens. I think many of us perceive this as being in the hands of the people who are in power, and it's very easy for us to say, well, what can I do? I mean, I can vote this way or that way, but other than that, and I think it's important for us not to become paralyzed with by inaction. And I think there are a lot of things that we can do locally too. I think, and this is not a plug for the Interfaith Center, but work like this I think really matters. If there are local organizations or nonprofits that are working towards advocacy against violence in your local community, get involved, volunteer. There are a number of ways locally that you can help that may or may not make a ceasefire happen, but they still matter. They're still important in our local community, because the local community matters just as much.
Absolutely. And not only is it frustrating for those of us living in the United States, feeling powerless, so many Palestinians and Israelis are powerless to control the decisions of their leaders, which is sad as well.
Indeed.
And I think there's a really important invitation for folks and a thing to consider as we're touching into, a lot of the depth, a lot of the pain and the pressure points that come with having this conversation. I mean, the idea of a mutually assured justice for all people should be a bare minimum idea in this conversation. And unfortunately, we are, in many communities, due to politics, due to power dynamics, due to a lot of these external forces that get involved in the conversation, direct all of our energies towards arguing with each other about who it's a shirt for, rather than realizing that no, it's a shirt for, it's supposed to be a shirt for all of us. And I think that pain speaks very clearly also, I think, to a question that I kind of have based on some of the ones that I'm seeing already for each of you panelists. And I think it's related to the larger struggle of the interfaith movement in its response to the crisis. In the past 5 months, there have been many interfaith organizations who have released statements, who have tried to host dialogues that have not been very successful, and whose relationships within the community, between communities, has become very fraught. And I know that this comes at the hands of dealing with the politics of the matter, that comes with the complexity of the reality of just dehumanizing communities in the name of politics. And I think it also comes with an unfortunate reality check that many interfaith communities need right now, about the years and decades that it took to build these relationships are now crumbling within weeks and months. And the question that I have for each of you is, what should be the role of interfaith community right now in order to make sure that communities that need to be heard, that are being represented, are actually getting the support that they need? Because oftentimes in this state of so many overlapping crises, a lot of folks turn to interfaith communities for support, whether it is through vigils, whether it's through dialogue spaces, whether it's through bringing people together to work on common action. And I think it'd be important to get your perspectives on what should interfaith communities be doing right now to actually make sure that they're helping those communities that are in pain.
I think, again, communication, reaching out, it's difficult after the trauma of October 7th and the months since then. Both communities are traumatized. And I have many Palestinian friends who aren't ready, to talk, who are still in so much pain. And continue to be in pain. And I'm in a great deal of pain. And I've had people of the faiths that are so entrenched in this reach out to me, and Muslims who are not from the Middle East, who as they say, they're not involved in the conflict, but through their Muslim tradition, as Ashraf said, their Muslim tradition says to reach out to people who are in pain, and they've reached out. But unfortunately, when trauma happens, particularly as it happened on October 7th, and as it has continued to happen, it's very difficult to have dialogue. And I think that we need to do more of these kinds of dialogues and programs. We need to, reach out and educate people who want to learn more about it. And God willing, and I have faith, the day will come when Jews and Muslims who are committed to and involved in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict will be able to be in dialogue. Because as Ashraf said, we don't make peace with our friends, we make peace with our enemies. And we have to, Mark said, Jesus taught, it's not just enough to love your neighbor, you have to love your enemies. One day we will. And people of good faith who want to see an end to conflict, like the Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, like people in other, areas of conflict, if they truly want to see peace and justice, then there will come a time that we will talk again. And I hope it's sooner than later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this question really, I feel this, because you're right. It's a touching point, and it is a point where interfaith communities, as you said, have been spending years and decades of work trying to build on these relationships. And it is so easy for relationships, or any relationships really, to fall apart very, very quickly. And I don't think there is an easy answer to this other than it's just hard work. Relationships of any kind are long, hard work. And as Alan said, this is a we're living through an international trauma right now. And so if our work is to build or perhaps rebuild those relationships, I think that work is going to be long and hard, as it has always been. But that's the work that is ours to do as people of faith, as people of faiths, plural. There's no easy answer for it other than Ashraf, I think you used the word not just listening, but active listening, and for our communities to actively listen to one another. I think it's going to be a lot of work like that. That's a very oversimplistic answer. I mean, that does not by any stretch exhaustively cover it, but I think that's it's a starting point.
I'm going to add to your point. I think this is asking the interfaith community. What's going on right now is putting a lot of strain on the interfaith community or interfaith dialogue, because it's putting a burden on them to be a voice for one of or each party, and that cannot happen. There is also an underlying, I would say, misconception, which is, again, I go back, that this is a religious conflict and somehow interfaith discussion between Jews and Muslims is going to solve it because it's a conflict between Muslims and Jews. It is not. It is a political conflict. And the fact that it is a political conflict put additional strain on the interfaith community, because we have an interfaith community groups that have political alliances that somehow are served by those interfaith work, or some of the players in the faith community, they have some political affiliation, or let's put it that way. And that's where it becomes difficult to manage that from that perspective. What's going on right now, anti-Semitic sentiment right now, and when we speak about Islamophobia, there is a totally different subset, which is anti-Palestinian, which not necessarily Islamophobia. Yes, there is an intersection there, but that is totally different. Being anti-Palestinian does not necessarily mean you are Islamophobe, but there is a definite intersection, because the majority of Palestinians are Muslims, right? So this is a very complex subject. But what is sad is we as an interfaith community, we're dealing with this trauma, and we have not been proactively dealing with this trauma, because this trauma did not start on October 7th. This trauma started with the blockade of Gaza, with the blockade of 2.4 million people, putting them under, in an open air prison. And it's, if we're asking the interfaith community to speak about the current situation, we should have been asking the interfaith community to speak about that. And to be honest, in these political conflict, that put a lot of strain on the interfaith community, because they are not supposed to solve those issues, but what they are supposed to stand up for justice. And when there are certain violations or aggression, that they speak out against it, and they hold the same standard for all the parties, for all people, no matter who they are or where they are. And that is a tall order. That is not simple. That is not an easy exercise on the interfaith community. A lot of the interfaith effort are, local, simple. These are geopolitical issues that are far beyond the interfaith community, though they can contribute a little bit into the understanding. So the idea of sharing narratives and being open to understand the narrative of other, and education, in my mind, is the best approach, or the best outcomes that the interfaith community can achieve by engaging in those activities.
And as Ashraf points out, this is a long-term conflict. And Ashraf mentioned accepting UN resolutions. And of course, in 1948, the UN passed a resolution to recognize the state of Israel. And I would say the conflict goes back even to that point when the Arab nations surrounding Israel did not accept that UN resolution, and we've been in conflict ever since. And the conflict, you can point to so many different points when the conflict began, but we can look back and place blame here and there, or we can look forward and figure out a way in which we can resolve this conflict.
There is a question that we had on the chat that what can you recommend a book to discuss similarity differences between the three faith holy books? I personally would start by saying read the holy books, because otherwise you are reading somebody else's interpretation. If you really want to understand, give yourself the time to do it yourself. Read the holy books, all of them, and see what's the difference and what the similarity between them. It is an instructive and educational exercise, I would say.
Agreed. I would agree. It's very inspirational too.
Yes.
And there are many different commentaries and resources on the holy books that are written from different faith perspectives. I'm currently reading a book by a Jewish scholar named Robert Alter. It's actually a collection of 3 books. It's the Hebrew Bible, a translation with commentary. This is a preeminent Jewish scholar who has done a translation of the Hebrew Bible from the Hebrew. And one of my spiritual practices during Lent has been to read, holy books of which I am not entirely unfamiliar, but pointedly from the point of view of a faith tradition that is not exclusively mine. And I think that's a great practice too. If you can find resources written from a faith perspective that is not necessarily yours, that's another good way of sort of broadening your own horizons.
Agreed.
There was an earlier question that I think got skipped. Fundamentally, each faith excludes the other. What hope is there in this status remaining?
As Ashraf said, there were times when we didn't exclude the other, when we were very much together, living together, and building societies together. Some of the greatest contributions came out of times when Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in peace together. Literature and science. When we're comfortable and when we're secure, we thrive. And when we're paranoid and afraid and threatened, we don't. So I think we have to look back to those times when we did live together, and we see it in parts of the United States. I mean, unfortunately, our own country is becoming so fractured, and we're gonna suffer from that as well. I mean, in my humble opinion, without getting political, some of the changes that have come down in our country recently because of politics and Supreme Courts, etc., are taking our country backwards, in my humble opinion. And some people even say, "Make America great again." What do they mean again? What's their definition of again? And I think we're without getting political, but I guess I just did. It's not a healthy thing for us to call out the other and separate ourselves and say that person is wrong and that live and let live, as they say.
Yeah, I would agree with what Alan said. I mean, fundamentally, the faiths should not exclude each other. I mean, the reality is that throughout history, historically, our different faith traditions have. There's been a long history throughout religion of violence, of war, of conflicts, but the confessions of our faiths, in my opinion, is that we should not do this. In the Christian tradition, one of the fundamental questions throughout the Gospels and the New Testament is who is in and who is out. And the Apostle Paul, many of Jesus' followers debated that question. And ultimately, I think where Jesus lands is that Jesus was trying to widen that door of welcome wider and wider and wider and wider, even beyond the boundaries of what was acceptable in his time. And I think that God is calling us to do the same in our own time, to continue to widen the door of inclusion even further than it is and has been. And as to what hope is there in the status remaining, the bad news is that many of our faith traditions have chosen throughout history not to do this. The hope is that we can choose to do it. You can choose to do it in your own life. Your faith community can make decisions to open that door of inclusion to others. That's I think that's what God calls us to do, is to include one another rather than exclude each other.
I echo some of the same points, but in my perspective is like, at least from the Islamic perspective does not exclude other faith, and it's a internal to the faith to acknowledge at least the two monotheistic religion, Christianity and Judaism, and even in the practice and the scholarly teaching, it goes beyond Judaism and Christianity to other faith tradition. I mean, one of the key teachings in some of Muslim scholars' books is that God has sent prophets to all mankind, and prophets come with the same message, which is to worship God, and they are all divine, no matter who they are. And in that context, Buddha and other Eastern could be prophets, though we don't have a conclusive evidence in the Quran they are, but we don't have also evidence they are not. So the potential is still there, and that gives you the impetus to be inclusive. And I would say in the golden period of Islam, that inclusivity was very prominent. That does not say there were historical time where it was not. But that inclusivity is there, at least in certain periods of time, as Alan has also mentioned. I just want to quickly comment on one thing, because it seems there was some comments about the hostages and so on. I just want to clarify that every life matter, every innocent life matter, every hostage matter. So when I talk about the hostages, I am not excluding the Israeli hostages. I am actually talking about all hostages. What I'm advocating is that the same way we put value on the life of Israeli hostages, we need to put value on the life of the, so far, 8,000 Palestinian hostages in Israeli prisons. So they are as important, they are as valuable, they are as human being as the Israeli and I'm saying this because they are not portrayed that ways. Part of the dehumanization that has been happening is that we see the stories of the Israeli hostages being presented, and they are painful and they are traumatic, and I would totally say that. But there's also traumatic stories and traumatic things going on where you have 8,000 Palestinians right now hostages in Israeli jails. So these are as much, important. From Islam perspective, Islam does not put a value on life based on faith or what's your religion. In the Quran, it says, whoever give life or protect the life of one person as if they save the humanity. And the one who take the life of one person doesn't say Muslim or non-Muslim or Muslim or Jews or Christian or whatever, but whoever takes the life of one person as if they took the life of humanity. So what I was advocating is just putting the same value on life as it is for others.
One question that I have for the panelists as we're sort of entering sort of these last 5-10 minutes is, during this time of engaging very difficult topics that do certainly lean into the political, the controversial, one that sends people into different corners of the room, what could be sort of the resources or the ways in which communities and organizations like the co-sponsors for today, as an example, could be making sure that we are providing to those communities on the ground. For many of the folks that may want to have a similar conversation in their own context, would it be helpful to have things like a resource guide, a toolkit, or a best practices sort of resource that we could share with folks? Or do you feel like there are ways that we could be thinking about how we're emphasizing sort of, um, a diversified approach in how we're having these conversations? There was someone actually earlier in the chat who had mentioned a suggestion about a way that something could be hosted. And let me just make sure that I'm reading it in front of you. A suggestion was made that perhaps a process where a larger group of participants has time to develop breakout groups could be useful. One round could be with our own identity group, mainly one that may adhere to a specific perspective or a specific worldview, and create some rounds after that of mixing those groups together. I guess in this case, if we were talking about Christians, Muslims, and Jews, with certain subjects of conversation given for groups to discuss, and then rejoining into the full group to share what transpired in the small groups. Do you feel like that kind of engagement, person to person, and then enveloping the entire community to be in a larger dialogue, could be one way of engaging in similar conversations? Or what do you find to have been useful in some of the ways that you've been engaging with communities on the ground?
Well, last Sunday, we responded to a number of people from different faiths who were just feeling a lot of pain, who were just really, really upset about the situation going on in Israel and Gaza. And they just felt they wanted to talk to people. And they just wanted to be able to express their feelings, maybe to get a hug from somebody. And the format we decided to use was to get to know the other. So you were paired up with somebody who you did not know. And, it's the classic exercise. Introduce yourself to the person, tell them about you, why you came here, etc. And then you're going to introduce that person back to the larger group. And then from that, we let people decide if they wanted to get together again with that individual that they just met. It kind of humanized the whole thing, and it really addressed what we could address, that somebody cares about what you're going through. And I want you to care about what I'm going through. And in terms of a resource guide, many of our interfaith groups stay away from politics. I mean, the statements, someone mentioned the statements that interfaith groups have come out with. We have been very careful to own the idea that both in the Gaza-Israel conflict, that both sides are suffering, that both sides are in need of healing. We've been very careful, and we have not gone to rallies. We've been invited to rallies that represented one side or the other, and we have not. We have said, if you're just going to represent one side or the other, we can't come, because we are not political, and that's getting political. And so, in terms of a resource guide, I want to go back to something that Ashraf said when he was talking about prophets and how the Quran reveals all of the prophets, from the beginning of the monotheistic prophets all the way through, with Muhammad as the final prophet. It made me think that, given our conversation, we need more prophets and less politicians. So I think a resource guide would be a wonderful piece that would present the teachings of the three Abrahamic faiths, and maybe other faiths, to Ashraf's point, and let people focus on what our values should be, and what justice is, rather than, again, getting into the conflict, and just helping people who are just in pain.
I mean, one thing we have been doing at the Islamic Center of Greater Cincinnati is we have a monthly open house where we have people come and learn about our faith, learn about our tradition, learn about what Islam calls for. And most of the time, these presentation go into questions about, a little bit about the conflict in Palestine and so on. So it touch on that, but I would also reiterate also that the interfaith uh, interfaith activity is not political activity. And when it's being asked to deliver a political solution or a political stance, it put the interfaith effort in a tough spot. So Alan's point about you can't take position, this is politics, and you have to stay away from it. The reality is some of us have to sometimes do it on both sides. You might have to do it on the religious side, but you still might be interested in the other side, so you do it on different venue at a different names. But that is a difficult position to put the interfaith activities in that situation. There's no easy solution.
I would just add one more thing before Mark talks. We have Ramadan coming up and we have Passover coming up, and these are wonderful opportunities to invite people from other faiths to experience an iftar dinner or a Passover Seder.
I think that's very well said. I don't really have a whole lot to add beyond what the two of you have already said. I don't have any brilliant pearls of inspiration in terms of putting together a perfect one-size-fits-all template for something like that. But I think as Alan and Ashraf sort of alluded to a little bit earlier, I think there's a lot of wisdom in recognizing that different persons are coming at this from different levels of comfort of engagement. Alan, I think you alluded a little earlier that because this is a trauma that we've gone through, there are some people that are ready to engage right away. There's some people that are not ready to do that yet. And so I don't know exactly what a template would look like that holds all of those things. But I think the ideas that both of you have presented are wonderful already. So I really don't have much to add to build on it. Not that stopped me from talking anyway, but.
I think one important thing. Oh, Alan, I'm so sorry.
I was just going to say, I have a perfect prayer, since this is a faith gathering. I have a perfect prayer to end with. It's very short, and it really addresses all the issues that we've discussed. So if there's time at the end, with your permission, I'd like to share that.
Yeah, you can give the closing, Alan, if you'd like. But Tahil wanted to make one last quick statement.
First to sort of say thank you to all of you, our panelists, for really engaging in a fundamentally challenging conversation, and really touching onto the harsh truths of what it means to engage in this. If there's anything that I think it's important for us to learn, it's that first and foremost, we are striving for a mutually assured justice, one that is inclusive and intersectional, of all people. And secondly, that, in this invitation to folks who are saying that, engaging in the political is very challenging, it can really sort of set things off. I invite you all to sort of reimagine it in a way as not an opportunity to engage in politics, but to engage in what is morally urgent. Because at a time when communities are suffering in the face of injustice, we do have to acknowledge the harsh truths and actually work towards uplifting, equalizing, and bringing people to a better world. And it requires all of us to really look at politics and to say, actually, I am coming from a place where I am called from my tradition to show up for what is right because it is right. And I hope that is an invitation for all of us on this call today, to really find that inspiration from our traditions, to engage in the sacred tension, to engage in the sacred discomfort, and to actually take it into account that it transforms us into more engaged people in the world. So Alan, Dr. Trablusi, Reverend Mark, thank all three of you. I thank my co-moderator, Geneva, for helping to be a lot of the main gears making this event possible, and to our co-sponsors. And I'll pass it over to Alan for our closing prayer.
May we see the day when war and bloodshed cease, when a great peace will embrace the whole world. Then nation will not threaten nation, and humankind will not know war. For all who live on earth shall realize we have not come into being to hate or to destroy. We have come into being to praise, to labor, and to love. Compassionate God, bless the leaders of all nations with the power of compassion. Fulfill the promise conveyed in Scripture, I will bring peace to the land, and you shall lie down, and no one shall terrify you. I will rid the land of vicious beasts, and it shall not be ravaged by war. Let love and justice flow like a mighty stream. Let peace fill the earth as the waters fill the sea.